The steam rose from the massive iron pots like morning fog over a battlefield. Margaret Chen wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her flour-dusted hand, leaving a white streak across her dark skin. The kitchen of Firebase Alpha was her domain, a cramped concrete bunker where she fed 300 hungry soldiers every single day. Outside, the sounds of war echoed across the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. But inside her kitchen, Margaret controlled everything. She had been cooking for the military for 8 years now, following her late husband's footsteps into service. When David died in Iraq, Margaret could have taken the insurance money and lived quietly somewhere safe. Instead, she chose to honor his memory by feeding the warriors he had fought alongside. The recruiter had looked surprised when she applied for a position in a combat zone. A middle-aged black woman wanting to work in one of the most dangerous places on Earth was not what they expected. "You sure about this, ma'am?" the young sergeant had asked, sliding the paperwork across his desk. "This ain't no regular army base. We're talking about forward operating bases where the Taliban shoots at us every day." Margaret had signed her name with steady hands. "My husband died protecting soldiers like you. The least I can do is make sure they eat well while they're fighting." Now, 3 years into her deployment, she was known throughout the region. Soldiers would request transfers just to eat at Margaret's kitchen. She had a way with spices that could make military rations taste like home cooking. More importantly, she had a way with people that made scared young men feel like they had a mother watching over them. The morning started like any other. Margaret arrived at 4 in the morning to begin preparations for breakfast. She unlocked the heavy metal door and flipped on the fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered before steadying. The kitchen smelled like yesterday's dinner and industrial cleaner. She moved with practiced efficiency, pulling ingredients from the massive refrigeration units and firing up the gas burners. By 5:30, her assistant cooks began arriving. Jenny Martinez, a young woman from Texas who reminded Margaret of her own daughter. Carlos Rodriguez, a former gang member from Los Angeles who had found purpose in the military kitchen. And Old Pete, a career soldier who had been cooking army food for 20 years and claimed he could make anything taste good with enough hot sauce. "Morning, Mama Chen," Jenny called out, using the nickname that had stuck despite Margaret's protests. "What's on the menu today?" "Same thing we serve every day," Margaret replied, already mixing batter for pancakes. "Good food that reminds these boys why they're fighting to get home." The first soldiers began lining up outside at 6 o'clock sharp. Margaret could hear them talking and laughing, their voices carrying the mixture of exhaustion and forced cheerfulness that came with living in a war zone. She knew most of them by name now. There was Rodriguez, the medic from Chicago who always asked for extra bacon, Thompson, the mechanic who liked his eggs over easy, and Jackson, the 19-year-old from Alabama who was afraid of spicy food, but too polite to say so. As she served breakfast, Margaret listened to the conversations around her. The soldiers talked about missions, about letters from home, about their fears and hopes. She had become their unofficial counselor, the person they trusted with their worries, because she wasn't part of their chain of command. "My girlfriend sent me a Dear John letter yesterday," Private Wilson confided as she handed him his tray. "Says she can't wait anymore." Margaret looked into his young eyes and saw her own son's face. "That girl wasn't meant for you then, baby. The right one will wait as long as it takes." "You really think so, Mama Chen?" "I know so. Now eat your breakfast before it gets cold." This was her life, feeding bodies and souls, one meal at a time. The officers respected her work but saw her as just support staff. The enlisted men loved her but thought of her as a mother figure, not a warrior. Everyone assumed that her only weapon was a wooden spoon, her only battlefield was the kitchen. They had no idea about her past. Before David, before marriage and cooking and this life of service, Margaret had been someone else entirely. She had grown up in Detroit during the crack epidemic, watching her neighborhood tear itself apart. Her father had been a Vietnam veteran who came home broken and angry. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Margaret had learned to shoot when she was 12, not for sport or hobby, but for survival. By 16, she was running with a crew that controlled 6 blocks of the East Side. She wasn't a drug dealer or a gangbanger in the traditional sense. She was something more dangerous, an enforcer. When negotiations failed, when respect wasn't being shown, Margaret was the one they called. She was 5 feet 4 inches of concentrated fury with a .45 caliber Colt in her hand and the skills to use it. She had killed her first man at 17. A dealer from a rival crew had tried to muscle in on their territory, had shot up a house where children were playing. Margaret had tracked him down 3 days later and put 2 bullets in his chest from 50 yards away. The police had questioned everyone on the block, but nobody saw anything, nobody heard anything. Margaret was just another young woman trying to survive in a city that had given up on people like her. But David had changed everything. He was a soldier on leave, visiting his grandmother in Margaret's neighborhood. He had seen something in her that she didn't even know existed. A goodness beneath the hardness, a protector beneath the predator. He had courted her for 6 months, patient and gentle, showing her a different way to live. "You got hands that can create, not just destroy," he had told her one evening as they sat on his grandmother's porch. "You could cook for people instead of hunting them." Margaret had laughed at first. The idea of her in a kitchen seemed absurd. But David had been persistent, had enrolled her in culinary school, had supported her through every class and every doubt. When they married, she had buried her old life completely. The guns went into storage, the skills went unused, the reputation faded into memory. Now, 8 years after David's death, nobody at Firebase Alpha knew about Detroit Margaret. They only knew Cook Margaret, the woman who made the best cornbread in the Hindu Kush and gave motherly advice to homesick soldiers. She preferred it that way, that life was over, buried with her husband. At least, that's what she thought. The day that would change everything started with unusual activity on the radio. Margaret was preparing lunch when she heard the communications officer's voice getting more urgent. Something was happening in the valley below their position, something that had the command staff worried. "All units, be advised," the voice crackled over the intercom. "Intelligence indicates possible large-scale Taliban movement in Sectors 7 and 8. Increased vigilance is authorized." Margaret paused in her vegetable chopping. In 3 years, she had learned to read the rhythms of military tension. This felt different, more serious than the usual daily skirmishes. She noticed that fewer soldiers were coming by for their usual mid-morning coffee runs. The ones who did appear seemed distracted, checking their weapons more often than usual. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commander, stopped by the kitchen around noon. He was a career officer who had always treated Margaret with professional respect, but had never lingered for conversation. "Mrs. Chen," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from her, "I wanted you to know that we might be implementing enhanced security protocols over the next few days. Nothing for you to worry about, just want to keep everyone informed." Margaret studied his face. She had learned to read people during her years on the streets, and Harrison was worried about something specific. "Enhanced protocols, sir?" "Increased patrols, elevated alert status. We've got intelligence suggesting the enemy might be planning something bigger than their usual harassment operations." After he left, Margaret found herself thinking about the base's defensive positions. Over 3 years, she had unconsciously cataloged every sight line, every blind spot, every potential avenue of attack. It was an old habit from Detroit, constantly assessing threats and escape routes. She had never really stopped being a predator, she realized. She had just learned to hide it under flour and kindness. That afternoon brought confirmation that something significant was developing. A convoy of Humvees rolled into the base, carrying soldiers from an outpost that had been evacuated. Margaret watched from her kitchen window as dusty, exhausted men unloaded gear and weapons. Their faces carried the particular tension that came with contact with the enemy. Sergeant First Class Morrison, one of her regular customers, stopped by the kitchen with his squad. They had been on patrol for 18 hours and looked like they needed more than just food. "Mama Chen," Morrison said, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "You got anything hot? We've been eating MREs for 2 days." As she served them stew and fresh bread, Margaret listened to their quiet conversation. They had been in a firefight that morning, had taken casualties. The Taliban forces they had engaged were better organized and better equipped than usual. Intelligence suggested that multiple groups were converging on their area of operations. "How many?" she asked Morrison when his men were out of earshot. He looked at her with surprise. Most civilians didn't ask for tactical details. "How many what, ma'am? How many are they saying might be coming?" Morrison studied her face for a moment. "More than we usually deal with. Maybe a lot more." That evening, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her small quarters, listening to the increased radio traffic and the sound of vehicles moving around the base. Through her window, she could see soldiers reinforcing defensive positions, setting up additional machine gun nests, stringing more concertina wire. She found herself thinking about her guns back in Detroit, a small arsenal that she had kept locked away but never sold. David had known about them, but had never asked her to get rid of them completely. "Sometimes a person needs options," he had said. "Just promise me you'll only use them to protect people, not hurt them." Margaret had never expected to need those skills again. She had built a new life around creation rather than destruction, around nurturing rather than hunting. But watching the soldiers prepare for what was clearly going to be a serious battle, she felt the old instincts stirring. She knew this base better than anyone. She knew which positions were strongest, which were most vulnerable. She knew every soldier's face, every soldier's story. These weren't just the people she cooked for anymore. They were her people, her responsibility. The next morning brought news that made everything clear. A patrol had been ambushed 6 miles south of the base. 2 soldiers killed, 4 wounded, 1 missing. The Taliban had used the attack to probe American response times and capabilities. Intelligence now estimated that over 300 enemy fighters were moving into position around Firebase Alpha. Margaret served breakfast with steady hands, but her mind was racing. 300 against the 150 soldiers currently on base. Not impossible odds, but not good ones either. She watched the young faces in her mess hall and saw the fear they were trying to hide. These boys were trained and brave, but many of them had never faced anything like what was coming. As she cleaned up after the morning meal, Margaret made a decision that surprised her. She walked to the communications bunker and asked to speak with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison privately. "Sir," she said when they were alone, "I need to tell you something about my background that might be relevant to our current situation." Harrison looked at her with polite attention. "Yes, Mrs. Chen?" "Before I was a cook, before I was married, I had different skills. I think it might be time to use them again." The conversation that followed would change everything about how Firebase Alpha prepared for the coming battle. And it would change everything about how people saw the woman they had labeled as just a cook. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stared at Margaret Chen with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. She had just told him things about her past that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The gentle woman who made the best meals on any forward operating base in Afghanistan was claiming to have skills that would make seasoned infantry soldiers take notice. "Mrs. Chen," Harrison said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. You're saying you have combat experience?" Margaret nodded, her hands calm and steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Not military combat, sir. Street combat. Different rules, but the fundamentals are the same. Target identification, range estimation, trigger control, tactical movement." And you believe these skills might be relevant to our current situation? Sir, I've been watching this base for 3 years. I know every sight line, every position, every weakness in our perimeter. I also know that we're about to be seriously outnumbered by people who want to kill everyone here. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. In his 15 years as an officer, he had never had a conversation quite like this one. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that you let me help defend this base instead of just feeding the people who are defending it. The skepticism on Harrison's face was obvious. Margaret had expected it. A 50-year-old cook claiming she could contribute to military operations sounded like fantasy. But she had lived through situations that these soldiers had only trained for. She knew what it meant to kill or be killed, to make split-second decisions when lives hung in the balance. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your willingness to help, but combat operations require specific training and certification. Even if you have some background with firearms, this isn't civilian law enforcement or street violence. This is coordinated military action. Margaret understood his position, but she also understood what was coming better than he did. Sir, with respect, I've killed more people than most of your soldiers have even shot at. I'm not talking about playing soldier or getting in the way. I'm talking about using skills I learned when my life depended on them every single day. The directness of her statement made Harrison pause. There was no bravado in her voice, no dramatic posturing. She spoke about killing people the same way she talked about preparing meals, as a necessary skill that she had mastered through experience and repetition. Even if what you're saying is true, Harrison said, I can't just hand weapons to civilian contractors and put them in combat positions. There are regulations, protocols. Sir, those regulations were written for normal situations. Is this a normal situation? Before Harrison could answer, Sergeant Major Rodriguez entered the bunker. He was a 30-year veteran who had served in every major conflict since Panama, and his face carried the particular grimness that came with bad news. Sir, we just received updated intelligence from Division. Satellite imagery confirms at least 400 enemy fighters moving into position. They've got mortars, RPGs, and at least 3 technical vehicles with mounted weapons. Intelligence estimates they'll be in position to attack within 36 hours. Harrison felt his stomach drop. 400 against 150 was not a battle. It was a potential massacre. What about reinforcements? Earliest possible arrival is 48 hours, sir. There's a major operation developing in Helmand Province that has priority for close air support and quick reaction forces. Margaret listened to this exchange with growing certainty that her offer was about to become much more relevant. She had been in hopeless situations before, had survived by using every advantage available, no matter how unconventional. Sergeant Major, she said, how many qualified snipers do we have on base right now? Rodriguez looked at her with surprise. It was an unusual question from a cook. 2, ma'am, Sergeant Walsh and Corporal Johnson. 2 snipers against 400 attackers, Margaret said. Sir, you're going to need every rifle you can get. Harrison was beginning to understand that his assumptions about Margaret Chen might need adjustment. Rodriguez, I want you to listen to what Mrs. Chen has to tell us. Then I want your honest assessment. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret laid out her background in detail. She talked about growing up in Detroit, about learning to shoot for survival, about the 6 years she had spent as an enforcer for one of the most dangerous crews in the city. She described firefights in abandoned buildings, precision shots from rooftops, tactical movement through hostile urban terrain. Rodriguez listened with the attention of a professional evaluating another professional. He asked specific questions about weapon systems, about marksmanship fundamentals, about combat stress management. Margaret answered each question with the kind of detail that only came from extensive hands-on experience. Ma'am, Rodriguez said finally, what's the longest confirmed kill shot you've ever made? 430 yards, Margaret replied without hesitation. Apartment building rooftop to street corner, One shot, center mass, .308 Winchester. Rodriguez exchanged a look with Harrison. That was serious sniper territory, not street gang shooting. What kind of rifle? Remington 700 with a loopholed scope. I still have it back home along with everything else. Everything else? Margaret smiled slightly. Let's just say I collected weapons the way other people collect recipes. Harrison was struggling to reconcile this information with everything he thought he knew about his head cook. Mrs. Chen, assuming for the moment that everything you're telling us is accurate, what exactly do you think you could contribute to our defense? Margaret had been thinking about this question since the previous evening. Sir, your biggest advantage in this fight is going to be your defensive positions and your superior marksmanship. But you're spread thin, and you don't have enough people to cover all the approaches to this base effectively. She pulled out a piece of paper and quickly sketched the base layout from memory. Her drawing was remarkably detailed and accurate, showing not just the major structures, but also the elevation changes, sight lines, and potential covered approaches. Your western perimeter is your weak point, she continued, marking the map. The terrain provides too much cover for attackers to get close. You've got 2 machine gun positions covering that sector, but they can't see into the dead space near the maintenance shed. Rodriguez studied her drawing. She was right about the western perimeter. It had been a concern during every tactical planning session. I know a position that overlooks that dead space, Margaret continued. It's not ideal for sustained fire, but it's perfect for precision shooting. Put me there with a good rifle and I can cover the approaches that your machine guns can't see. Harrison was beginning to realize that this conversation had moved beyond the theoretical. You're seriously suggesting that I put you in a combat position? Sir, I'm suggesting that you use every asset available to keep this base from being overrun. I've been here for 3 years. These soldiers aren't just people I cook for anymore. They're my family. I'm not going to hide in a bunker while they die protecting me. Rodriguez had served with enough soldiers to recognize the real thing when he heard it. Margaret Chen might be a cook now, but she talked like someone who had been in the fight before and wasn't afraid to be in it again. Sir, Rodriguez said to Harrison, I think we need to test her claims. That afternoon, Margaret found herself on the base's small arms range with Rodriguez and 2 other senior NCOs. Word had spread through the base that the cook was claiming to be some kind of marksman, and several soldiers had found reasons to be in the area. Rodriguez handed her a standard M4 carbine, the same weapon carried by every infantry soldier. Margaret examined it quickly, checking the sight alignment and trigger pull. The rifle felt familiar in her hands. Lighter than the weapons she had used in Detroit, but well-balanced and reliable. Standard qualification course, Rodriguez said. We'll start close and work our way back. Margaret nodded and settled into a firing position. The first targets were at 50 meters, well within the capability of any decent shooter. She fired a 3-round burst that put all 3 bullets within an inch of center. Good shooting, ma'am, Rodriguez said. Let's move back to 100 meters. At 100 meters, Margaret's shots were still grouped tightly in the center of the target. At 200 meters, her accuracy remained consistent, but it was at 300 meters that she began to separate herself from ordinary marksmen. The wind was gusting from the east, requiring shooters to compensate for drift. Margaret spent a moment studying the flags and vegetation, calculating the wind's effect on her bullet trajectory. When she fired, her shot struck dead center. Holy shit, someone whispered from behind her. Rodriguez increased the distance to 400 meters, the maximum range of the small arms course. At this distance, many trained soldiers struggled to hit the target consistently. Margaret adjusted her position slightly, controlled her breathing, and squeezed off a single shot. The spotting scope confirmed what the sound had suggested, a perfect center hit. Ma'am, Rodriguez said, I need to see what you can do with a precision rifle. 20 minutes later, they were at the long-range course with a military sniper rifle. The M24 was similar to the weapon Margaret had used in Detroit, and she felt immediately comfortable with its weight and balance. The first target was at 600 meters. Margaret's shot hit the target's center ring. The second shot, at 800 meters, hit just outside center. At 1,000 meters, the maximum range of the course, her bullet found its mark despite challenging wind conditions. The small crowd of soldiers who had gathered to watch was completely silent. They had just witnessed shooting that matched or exceeded the capabilities of trained military snipers. Rodriguez turned to face the group. "This demonstration is classified. Nobody discusses what they just saw outside of official channels. Is that understood?" A chorus of, "Yes, Sergeant Major," came from the assembled soldiers. That evening, Harrison called Margaret back to the command bunker. Also present were Rodriguez and Captain Williams, the base's operations officer. The mood in the room was serious but no longer skeptical. "Mrs. Chen," Harrison began, "based on today's demonstration and Sergeant Major Rodriguez's assessment, I'm prepared to consider your proposal, but I need to understand exactly what you're asking for." Margaret had spent the afternoon thinking about this conversation. "Sir, I'm asking to be integrated into your defensive plan as a sniper. Give me a position where I can cover areas that your other shooters can't reach, and let me help protect this base." "The position you mentioned on the western perimeter?" "Yes, sir. It's not perfect, but it covers the dead space near the maintenance shed and has sight lines to 3 different approach routes." Captain Williams consulted his notes. "That position would be completely isolated from the main defensive line. If you get overrun, there's no way to provide support." Margaret nodded. "I understand, sir. I also understand that if the western perimeter gets breached, the entire base becomes indefensible." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. In his entire military career, he had never faced a decision quite like this one. He was about to put a civilian contractor in a combat position, armed with a military weapon, responsible for defending a sector of his base's perimeter. On the other hand, he was facing a battle where he was outnumbered nearly 3-1, with no hope of reinforcement before the fight began. Margaret Chen might be a cook, but she was also apparently a highly skilled marksman with combat experience. Given their situation, could he afford not to use every capable person available? "Mrs. Chen," Harrison said finally, "if I approve this, you'll be under military authority for the duration of the engagement. You'll follow orders, maintain radio contact, and withdraw if directed. Is that acceptable?" "Yes, sir." "You understand that this is extremely dangerous. The position you're requesting is isolated and will likely attract significant enemy attention." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Sir, I've been in dangerous places before. The difference is that this time I'll be fighting for people I care about instead of fighting for territory or money." Harrison nodded slowly. "Rodriguez, I want you to work with Mrs. Chen on integrating her position into our overall defensive plan. Williams, make sure she has proper communications equipment and ammunition." As the meeting broke up, Rodriguez approached Margaret privately. "Ma'am, I want you to know that what you're volunteering to do is way beyond anything anyone could expect from a civilian." Margaret smiled. "Sergeant Major, I stopped being a civilian a long time ago. I just forgot it for a while." That night, as Margaret prepared what might be her last meal service for Firebase Alpha, she felt a familiar sensation. It was the calm alertness that came before violence, the mental state that had kept her alive during her years on the streets of Detroit. She had buried that part of herself when she married David, had tried to replace the predator with the nurturer. But now, facing the prospect of losing everything she had built in this remote corner of Afghanistan, Margaret realized that she had never really changed. She had simply learned to use her protective instincts in a different way. Tomorrow, she would protect her people the same way she had always protected what mattered to her, with deadly precision and absolute determination. The attack began before dawn, just as Margaret had expected it would. She had been in position for 3 hours, lying prone behind a carefully constructed hide on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the western approach to Firebase Alpha. The M24 sniper rifle felt like an old friend in her hands, its weight and balance familiar despite the years since she had last held a precision weapon. Through her scope, Margaret could see the Taliban fighters moving through the valley below. They were better organized than she had anticipated, advancing in coordinated groups with proper tactical spacing. These weren't untrained insurgents or desperate fanatics. These were experienced fighters who knew what they were doing. Her radio crackled softly. "Overwatch 2, this is command. Report status." Overwatch 2 was her call sign, chosen because she was the second sniper position in the defensive plan. Sergeant Walsh, positioned on the eastern side of the base, was Overwatch 1. Command, Overwatch 2. I have visual on approximately 30 enemy fighters advancing along Route Bravo. Distance 800 meters and closing. Copy, Overwatch 2. Do not engage until given authorization. Margaret understood the tactical reasoning behind waiting, but every instinct she had developed during her years in Detroit was screaming at her to start shooting. In street combat, the side that shot first usually won. But this wasn't street combat, and she wasn't in charge. The first explosion came from the eastern perimeter where Walsh was positioned. Almost immediately, the radio came alive with reports of contact. The Taliban had begun their assault with a coordinated mortar attack, followed by direct fire from multiple directions. All units, this is command. We are taking fire from all sectors. Weapons free, weapons free. Margaret's world suddenly narrowed to the view through her rifle scope. The advancing Taliban fighters were now 600 meters away and had broken into smaller groups to present more difficult targets. She selected her first target carefully, a fighter carrying what appeared to be an RPG launcher. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope she watched the man drop. One threat eliminated. She shifted to acquire her next target, a fighter who seemed to be directing the movement of others. Another shot, another kill. For the next hour, Margaret worked with the methodical precision that had made her reputation in Detroit. Each shot was carefully aimed, each target carefully selected for maximum tactical impact. She prioritized leaders, weapons specialists, and anyone carrying heavy weapons that could threaten the main defensive positions. The Taliban fighters had not expected to face precision rifle fire from the western side of the base. Their intelligence had probably identified the machine gun positions and the main defensive perimeter, but they had not accounted for a sniper covering the dead space near the maintenance shed. As the battle intensified, Margaret began to hear the distinctive sounds that she remembered from urban firefights: the whistle of incoming rockets, the chatter of automatic weapons, the shouts of wounded and dying men. But there was something different about this fight. In Detroit, she had been protecting territory and reputation. Here, she was protecting people who had become her family. Overwatch 2, this is command. We have a problem. Margaret keyed her radio while keeping her eye on the scope. Go ahead, command. Enemy forces have broken through the northern perimeter. They're moving toward the command bunker. Can you provide support? Margaret turned her rifle toward the north, scanning for targets. The Taliban fighters who had penetrated the perimeter were using the cover of smoke and debris to advance toward the heart of the base. She could see them moving in short rushes between buildings, coordinating their movement with military precision. She selected a fighter who was providing covering fire for his advancing teammates. The range was over 400 meters, complicated by shifting wind and the smoke from multiple fires. Margaret adjusted her aim point and fired. The man dropped, and his teammates hesitated, unsure where the shot had come from. Command, Overwatch 2. Enemy advance element neutralized. I can see at least 6 more moving toward Building 3. Copy. Continue to provide support. For the next 30 minutes, Margaret turned her attention to the northern sector. Each shot she fired disrupted the Taliban advance, forcing them to take cover and slowing their movement toward critical areas of the base. She was no longer just covering the western approach. She had become a mobile asset that could provide precision fire wherever it was needed most. but the Taliban were learning. They had identified the general area where her shots were coming from, and they were beginning to direct mortar fire toward her position. Margaret heard the distinctive whistle of incoming rounds and pressed herself flat against the rocky ground as explosions erupted around her. Shrapnel peppered the rocks above her head, and dust filled her eyes. But her position had been well chosen, protected by natural rock formations that absorbed most of the blast effects. She waited for the bombardment to stop, then resumed her observation of the battlefield. Overwatch 2, are you still operational? Command, Overwatch 2, still here, still shooting. The battle was now in its third hour, and Margaret could see that the Taliban assault was beginning to falter. Their initial coordination was breaking down under the sustained defensive fire from the base. Bodies littered the approaches to Firebase Alpha, and the surviving attackers were becoming more cautious and less aggressive. But the most dangerous part of the fight was still to come. Through her scope, Margaret watched as a group of Taliban fighters began setting up what appeared to be a recoilless rifle in a position that would allow them to destroy the main gate. If they succeeded, the remaining attackers could pour through the breach and overwhelm the defenders. The weapon crew was positioned nearly a kilometer away, at the extreme range of her rifle. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and heat shimmer from the sun-baked rocks made target identification difficult. But Margaret had made impossible shots before. She spent several minutes studying the target, calculating wind speed and direction, estimating the range with the precision that had kept her alive in Detroit's most dangerous neighborhoods. The crew was working methodically to prepare their weapon, apparently confident that they were beyond the range of effective small arms fire. Margaret controlled her breathing, settled into her firing position, and placed the crosshairs on the man who appeared to be the crew leader. She held for a moment, waiting for a lull in the wind, then squeezed the trigger. The shot took nearly 2 seconds to reach its target. Margaret watched through her scope as the man collapsed, struck in the upper chest. The other crew members looked around in confusion, unable to determine where the shot had come from. Before they could reorganize, Margaret fired again. The second crew member dropped, and the remaining Taliban fighters abandoned their weapon and fled toward better cover. The threat to the main gate had been neutralized. Command, Overwatch 2. Enemy heavy weapons team neutralized. They will not be firing on the main gate. Outstanding shooting, Overwatch 2. Stand by for new tasking. As the afternoon wore on, the Taliban assault gradually lost momentum. Their carefully planned attack had been disrupted by unexpected resistance from multiple directions. They had not anticipated facing precision rifle fire from positions they couldn't see, delivered by shooters who seemed to anticipate their every move. Margaret had fired 63 rounds and had scored 57 hits. Each shot had been aimed at a specific target. Each kill had served a specific tactical purpose. She had eliminated weapons crews, leaders, and key personnel who were coordinating the assault. More importantly, she had forced the attacking force to constantly worry about threats from unexpected directions. As the sun began to set, the Taliban fighters began to withdraw. They had suffered massive casualties for minimal gain, and their morale was clearly broken. The attack that was supposed to overrun Firebase Alpha in a matter of hours had been turned into a grinding defensive battle that they could not win. All units, this is command. Enemy forces are withdrawing. Maintain defensive positions but do not pursue. Margaret remained in position for another hour, watching through her scope as the surviving Taliban fighters retreated into the mountains. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to relax. Her radio crackled. Overwatch 2, this is command. Return to base for debrief. Margaret gathered her equipment and began the careful movement back to the main base. Her legs were stiff from hours of lying in shooting position, and her throat was dry from the dust and smoke. But she felt the particular satisfaction that came from a job well done under the worst possible conditions. When she entered the command bunker, she found Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, Sergeant Major Rodriguez, and most of the senior staff waiting for her. Their faces showed a mixture of respect, amazement, and something approaching awe. "Mrs. Chen," Harrison said, "Sergeant Walsh reports that your precision fire was directly responsible for breaking up at least 3 separate assault waves. Without your contribution, this base would almost certainly have been overrun." Rodriguez stepped forward with a piece of paper in his hands. "Ma'am, preliminary count shows that you accounted for 57 confirmed enemy kills. That's more than our entire infantry company combined." Margaret set down her rifle and accepted a bottle of water from one of the staff officers. "Sir, I just did what needed to be done. Same as everyone else." "No, ma'am," Harrison said firmly. "What you did today was extraordinary. You saved lives and saved this base." Over the next several hours, as the base dealt with casualties and assessed damage, word spread about the cook who had turned out to be a deadly sniper. The soldiers who had seen Margaret serving them breakfast just that morning struggled to reconcile that image with the woman who had spent the day systematically destroying an enemy assault force. Private Wilson, the young soldier who had confided in Margaret about his girlfriend troubles, approached her as she was cleaning her rifle. "Mama Chen," he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "I just wanted to say thank you. Rodriguez told us what you did today." Margaret looked up at his young face, still streaked with dust and sweat from the battle. "Baby, you don't need to thank me. We're family here. Family protects family." "But, ma'am, you could have hidden in a bunker or been evacuated. You didn't have to fight." Margaret smiled as she continued working on her rifle. "Wilson, let me tell you something. I've been running from fights my whole life, always trying to be someone I wasn't. Today I remembered who I really am. I'm someone who protects the people she loves, no matter what it takes." That evening, as Margaret returned to her kitchen to prepare the evening meal, she felt a sense of completeness that she hadn't experienced since David's death. For years, she had tried to honor his memory by suppressing the warrior inside her and embracing only the nurturer. But today had taught her that both sides of her nature could serve the same purpose. She was still the cook who made the best cornbread in Afghanistan. Still the woman who listened to homesick soldiers and offered motherly advice. But she was also someone who could kill at extreme range with surgical precision, someone who could face overwhelming odds without flinching, someone who had earned her place among the warriors. The soldiers who came to dinner that evening looked at Margaret with new eyes. They had always respected her as a cook and valued her as a friend. Now they knew her as something more, a protector who had risked everything to keep them safe. As she served the evening meal, Margaret listened to the soldiers recounting the day's events. They talked about the close calls, the moments when the battle could have gone either way, the friends who had been wounded or killed. But they also talked about the mysterious sniper who had seemed to be everywhere at once, picking off enemy targets with impossible accuracy. "I heard she got 57 confirmed kills," one soldier was saying. 57! That's like something out of a movie." "Rodriguez said she was shooting at ranges where most people can't even see the targets," another added. Margaret smiled as she worked, listening to them try to make sense of what they had witnessed. Tomorrow, she would return to being just a cook in their minds. The rifles would be cleaned and stored, the tactical gear put away, the warrior persona retired once again. But she would never again doubt her ability to protect the people who mattered to her. She had spent 8 years learning to create rather than destroy, to nurture rather than hunt. Today had proven that she didn't have to choose between those sides of herself. She could be both the woman who made meals with love and the woman who defended her family with deadly skill. As the last soldier finished his dinner and headed off to his duties, Margaret cleaned her kitchen with the same methodical precision she had used to clean her rifle. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve and protect. She was ready for whatever came next. The woman they had labeled as only a cook had reminded everyone, including herself, that labels meant nothing when lives were on the line. She was Margaret Chen, cook, protector, warrior, and guardian of the people she loved.